Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. So today we're going to be talking about the newly reworked Shadow Priest set. So Blizzard finally followed through with their promises, uh, and they've officially released the reworked set. So this came out yesterday. I've had probably 4 or 5 hours worth of testing with this already, so I feel pretty confident that I understand pretty much everything that's going on here. So I wanted to walk through it with you guys real quick. Um, so first things first, what's the change? Well, they mentioned previously that they were going to change the two piece to focus on Devouring Plague rather than Dark Thoughts, and that's kind of what happened, but kind of not. So before, Dark Thoughts used to have an additional 5% chance to trigger for each dot that you had on the target, right? So it would be, if you had Misery, if you had Vampiric Touch, it would be an additional 5% instead of just the 3% that you had originally. So you'd have 8% total, and then if you had two dots, Vampiric Touch and Shadow Word Pain, for instance, it would be an additional 10%, so you'd be at 16% because you have the original 3% per dot. And then if you had the Devouring Plague up as well, you'd have an additional 15%, right, to trigger Dark Thoughts when you were channeling Mind Flay. So that was the very important part, is that these Dark Thoughts procs would only happen if you were channeling Mind Flay. So that's something that they never really talked about in the tier set, was that the problem wasn't that it was centered around Dark Thoughts. The problem was that it was centered around Mind Flay. You had to be channeling Mind Flay to get those Dark Thoughts procs, and I think that's what they meant when they said that they were going to change the two-piece, because this new two-piece still is centered around Dark Thoughts. The difference is, though, that instead of having to channel Mind Flay to proc the Dark Thoughts, you have two options. It's both our spenders. So you can either cast Devouring Plague, which has a 40% chance to grant a Dark Thought, or you can cast Searing Nightmare, which has a 25% chance to grant Dark Thought. So this is a very good change in my opinion. So I was very clear in the last video that I absolutely hate pressing Mind Flay. It's like my least favorite ability that Shadow Priests have. It's super uninspired, I would say. And Devouring Plague is an ability that I enjoy pressing. It's a very good one. You know, it's our big hard-hitting nuke. It's a really nice, it does a lot of damage, feels good to press. It's instant cast, so you can use it while moving. All those good things. It adds to our mastery, so not only do you get the initial damage and the damage from the dot, but you also get the benefit of increasing your mastery for all your other damage, right? So it's like a twofold spell when you press it. You don't just press it for its damage, you also get the additional damage from your mastery, right? So Devouring Plague, I think, is a really good direction to take the tier set instead of Mind Flay. And then the Searing Nightmare change, this one is their attempt to kind of address the AoE problem that Shadow Priest has, and they changed the, if we look down here, they changed the 4-piece as well to do shadow damage over 8 seconds to all enemies within 10 yards of your target, instead of just being a single target cast. If you watched any of the previous videos, you know that before, the Living Shadow would basically just channel a Mind Flay into whatever target it was attacking, right? These days, it still looks like Mind Flay, but it acts like Mind Seer, where it doesn't do the radiate animation, but it does radiate damage to things within 10 yards. And I'll get to some issues with that in a second. But yeah, so that's why they added this Searing Nightmare portion of it, is so that you don't have to be, when you're doing mass AoE and let's say miss a Tyranid Scythe or something, you're going to have chances to get these Dark Thoughts without having to use Devouring Plagues, when you'd rather just be spamming Searing Nightmare, right? So this will give you chances to get those Dark Thoughts. And excuse me. So let's talk about this a little bit. So this has some interesting implications. First off, it means that insanity generation is more valuable for us, right? So we already have a ton of insanity generation inside CDs, so that's not going to be a problem at all. But when we're outside of CDs, in moments where we don't have power infusion, so we've got less haste, We're not in void form or anything, so we don't have void bolts generating insanity, that kind of thing. We're more inclined at this point. I mean, we already wanted to be generating as much insanity as possible outside of CDs, but we're even more inclined at this point because getting as many Devouring Plagues off as possible is going to be a really, really big priority for your tier set, right? Because it's going to spawn these living shadows. So this has some interesting implications. It means that Shadowflame Prism is more valuable than it used to be. It's going to be stronger than with the previous iteration of this tier set. Mostly because Shadow Priest is a 2-minute class, right? So you've got this big peak at 2 minutes, and then once you get to 1 minute, if you're Necrolord, which we're gonna be in the upcoming patch, once you get to 1 minute, you have another small spike of Unholy Nova, and then once you get to 2 minutes again, you get another big spike, and then 1 minute, you get your Pallid Command again, that kind of thing, right? So Shadowflame Prism synergizes with that kind of damage profile really well, and it also synergizes with this tier set really well. What I mean by that is when you play Shadowflame Prism, you play Mindbender, and Mindbender is on a 1 minute cooldown, which lines it up perfectly with every 2 minute spike and every 1 minute spike, right? So it's gonna buff the things that we're already doing well, and the other good part about Shadowflame Prism is that the Mindbender is going to increase our insanity generation specifically around those 1 minute spikes when we don't have, Power Infusion or Void Form or any of our really big cooldowns running, and our insanity generation is a little bit lower or closer to the lowest it will be during our entire rotation, right? So having Mindbender during those 1 minute spikes is going to increase our insanity generation to a pretty decent level where you're going to start getting more of these Devouring Plagues with Dark Thoughts procs. So something else I wanted to mention about this this tier set is that when it says casting Devouring Plague has a 40% chance to grant a Dark Thought, this is only on cast. So in all the testing that I've done, if you press Devouring Plague, you have a chance to get the Dark Thought, and then as it ticks, you don't have a chance to get a Dark Thought from every tick. I haven't had a single Dark Thought proc strictly from a Devouring Plague tick after I've casted it. Pretty sure it's just on cast. You get the 40% chance, it rolls a dice, boom, you hit, you don't get the Dark Thought. Okay, you gotta wait until you cast another Devouring Plague to get one. I will also mention you can still get Dark Thoughts procs through channeling Mind Flay, which means that our Mind Flay is a little bit more of a priority than it used to be, although it's really not going to have any effect, because in the past, we didn't really care about Dark Thoughts procs. They were okay, but it wasn't like, we were never like channeling Mind Flay to try and get them. But now those Dark Thoughts procs are going to be a little bit stronger than they were in the past, so there's a little bit more incentive for us to be channeling Mind Flay to try and get them. It's just that for all intents and purposes, you're just going to be using Mind Flay as your filler like we were before, and if you happen to get a Dark Thoughts proc, it's just an RNG bonus. Which brings me to one of the problems that I wanted to talk about with this tier set, which is it feels pretty corruption-esque, I'll say, in the sense that, so Shadow Priests didn't really have a problem with corruption being like super RNG, because we would just play Severe and Expedient, right, and it would just buff your haste and your crit all the time, so there was no RNG involved. But there were classes, specifically like Havoc Demon Hunter, who played Infinite Stars, and Havoc Demon Hunters would just do their regular rotation, and it was up to RNG whether they did good damage or not, because they could just not get any Infinite Stars procs, or randomly get a million Infinite Stars procs, and that had nothing to do with the skill of the Demon Hunter. It was just purely how are the dice rolling that day, right? And this tier set has a bit of that to it. I really don't like having player power tied to RNG. So like this Devouring Plague has a 40% chance to grant a Dark Thought. If you're in the middle of CDs, I've had this happen 3 or 4 times now, where we're going for a 5-minute dummy test. I'm with my guildies, we pop Lust, we pop Pot, everything, we're all blasting. And during my first initial CD window, I don't get a single Dark Thought, right? So I cast a bunch of Devouring Plagues because I'm in CDs, and I just hit the 60% chance to not get one every single time, right? And that feels really, really bad. And there's nothing that I can do differently to increase my chances, right? It's not like I'm playing poorly. It's just that the game decided, no, I don't get any, right? And that is one of my biggest problems with this so far. I'll be honest though, a 40% chance like this means that on average, you usually get a decent amount of these Dark Thoughts, and it's like the low rolling feels really bad and is pretty it doesn't happen super often. It's pretty rare to low roll so bad that you like don't get any during your CD window or something, especially with how much haste we have in Insanity Generation and how many times we're rolling the dice. It means that to get a 60% chance, which is the chance that you won't get a Dark Thought, to get that chance multiple times in a row, I mean, it just exponentially drops off, right? It's 0.6 to the power of however many times you don't get a Dark Thought, right? So it eventually gets, pretty difficult for you to continuously not get Dark Thoughts. So it's pretty rare. I mean, on average, you have a really high uptime of this Living Shadow. It's something like for my testing, most of the time I have like 78 to 80% uptime of this Living Shadow if I'm just getting average RNG, not doing anything crazy. And again, I mean, that's just the game saying, whether or not I get one, right? But I have seen some really bad low rolls where I've had these are all 5-minute one target sims, not sims, but situations, I guess, because it's just me hitting a one target dummy for 5 minutes, right? I've had some really low roll scenarios where I have like barely over 55% uptime, maybe 60% uptime. But then I've also, I mean, those are really rare, like maybe 3 times in 5 hours that I've tested this or something. And then for high rolls, I've had a couple of those as well, probably just as rare. But the highest I've had is like 93% uptime, 94% uptime, something crazy like that. And that's a lot of uptime. Basically, so I mentioned this in my previous video, but anytime you cast a Dark Thought while your shade is already out, it just extends the duration by 8 seconds, right? So let's say you cast your first Dark Thought, the shade is out, it's been 4 seconds, so it has 4 seconds remaining on the buff. If you cast another one, it just goes up to 12 seconds. So instead of like pandemicking, going up to 8 seconds and then adding another 2 or something, it just adds on 8, boom. And even if you're at like 50 seconds, if you cast another Dark Thought, it just goes up to 58 seconds. So this is, I mean, it's really nice. It means that you can have like minute and a half long shadows that are just going to be there for forever, right? Which is nice in the sense that it's like super, super valuable. You lose nothing by pressing a Dark Thought anytime you press one. There's a bit of a caveat to that, which is that they reverted the change on the cast of the Living Shadow from 40 seconds, which it was in the second iteration of the tier set, back to the 6 seconds that it was at the beginning. So the shade will, it says it does shadow damage over 8 seconds. That's just wrong. I mean, you get the buff for 8 seconds, but it takes like 1 second, maybe 1.5 seconds for the shade to pop up out of your character. And then after it's done that, it'll channel a 6-second cast, and that's when it does the damage. So it's actually doing damage over 6 seconds to all enemies within 10 yards of your target. It's just that it starts the buff at 8 seconds because the first second or second and a half of it, your shade is coming out of your body, right? So this is something that I brought up in the first video where I talked about how having a long time on your shadow is going to be more DPS than letting your shadow fall off and then bringing it back up and then falling off and then bringing it back up, because of this animation thing that happens when you first summon your shadow. And I wonder why Blizzard decided to go back to this. I imagine that this was an unintentional revert, right? So back in the day, when they first announced the tier set, they said, hey guys, look at the sweet tier set. And we said, hey, this 6-second channel thing is causing a lot of issues when you have a really long duration shadow. It makes it so that it stops casting every 6 seconds or so. And then it takes about a second to recast, maybe half a second, right? And they were like, oh yeah, that is a problem. First they said, we're going to rework the Shadow Priest tier set. And then we told them about all these issues, and then they started working on these issues. And they updated it to the 40 seconds, but I imagine that they were already working on the new tier set, and so when they just pushed the new tier set, they forgot about all the stuff they had fixed previously. Some other issues still remain with our 4-piece. For instance, I've had issues where it says it does damage to all enemies within 10 yards of your target. I think the intention is that this would be only targets that you're in combat with. However, I have had this pull things that I'm not in combat with. This is something that would be really, really bad for Mythic Plus. I've tested on target dummies where I'm only hitting one of them, and there are 2 more within 10 yards that I haven't touched, and when my shade starts channeling on the one, it hits all 3, right? And it puts me in combat with all 3 of them. So if this remains like this is something that I really hope Blizzard changes, because imagine you're in like Necrotic Wake or something where there are some pretty tight spaces between packs of mobs, right? And you target one of them, and your shade hits it, and then also pulls an additional pack, and it's bolstering or something, and you bolster the boss 8 times, and now you guys are just screwed, right? That would be a really, really bad thing. So I really hope that they fix this problem. On top of that, the shade, it does the casting thing, like I said, where you have some downtime, so you benefit more if you leave it up rather than having it go down and coming back up. You want to spend your Dark Thoughts as much as possible. If you could get like a 1-minute duration on your shade, you're golden. You want to have as much time as you can. And then another thing, the targeting of the shade is really inconsistent now. So back when I tested the old tier set, I could consistently figure out what it was targeting, right? So it says that it does damage to all enemies within 10 yards of your target, right? So you would assume that this means it'll target what you're targeting, right? And in the old tier set, this was not the case. And in the new tier set, this is still not the case. It doesn't target what you're targeting consistently. In the old tier set, what I figured out through testing was that it will target the closest thing that you're in combat with. That is no longer the case. So with this new tier set, there were times where I'm fighting 2 target dummies, right? I'm standing next to this one, and my shade starts targeting this one way over on the other side, right? So I'm like literally on top of this one. So it is by far the closest thing to me, right? And my shade just decides to target the other one for some reason. So I haven't been able to figure out exactly what the targeting AI for this is, but if it remains like this, it's really annoying. So it's more than just inconsistent. I wonder if maybe it was trying to target like the center of mass of the things I was in combat with. So for instance, let's say I'm in combat with this guy, and this guy. If I'm closest to this guy, then I think maybe the shade is going to target the one in the middle, excuse me, just so that it can get its AoE on as much things as possible. That's like my armchair tinfoil hat theory crafting, right? I think maybe if they were trying to be like smart about it, maybe they're like, oh, we'll just have the shadow target the center of mass of things you're in combat with, which would be good for AoE, but it's not super consistent. And I haven't been able to figure out if that's actually the case, because there have been times where I'm in combat with 2 like this. I'm right next to this one, and my shade does target this one. It's really inconsistent. It depends on the pull. So anyway, last thing I'll mention before I wrap this video up, it's gone a little bit longer than I was intending. You'll see that this tooltip has changed. I don't know if you guys can read that. It said before, in the most recent iteration before this one, it said your shadow follows you, dealing 1038% of your spell power shadow damage over however many seconds to your target, right? These days it says it deals 26 with an 8, so it's actually 268. They just There's like a weird typo here. This percent sign should be after this 8. It does 268%, which is significantly less than 1038. The reason for this is that, like I said, they reduced the channel time from 40 seconds down to 6 again. So in the first version of this tier set, this number was 138%, and then they bumped that number way up because they made the channel longer. So it wasn't actually doing any more damage. It's just that the channel was 5 times as long, so the number was also 5 times as big, right? So this is a buff, even though it looks like a nerf. It's actually like 130% more spell power, which was desperately needed for our tier set. Before, our tier set did so little damage that you basically ignored it entirely. Now, our tier set is my #1 damage on pretty much every pull. If you get really bad low rolls, then it'll be like #2. But it does really good damage, especially when you start hitting like multiple targets. It'll cleave, right? And it'll do decent damage to all of them. So I'm just gonna wrap it up there. That's pretty much all I had to say about this. If you guys have any thoughts or anything, feel free to, leave them in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think of the new tier set. I'm pretty excited. I imagine that with this, if they tune this right, I imagine they'll still try to tune this damage number a little bit. Hopefully it stays strong. If they tune this right, they fix the consistency problems with the targeting, and they figure out something about the channeling thing, because that is so frustrating when you have a 10-second buff and it doesn't channel for 2 of those seconds because it's recasting. That is so frustrating. So if they fix those issues, I think we're in a really good spot. I already think this is leaps and bounds better than it used to be. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I'm super interested. And if you want to talk more about this kind of stuff, feel free to check the description for a link to my Discord server. I'd love to come chat with you guys. Other than that, if you liked the video, make sure you click the like button. If you really liked it, feel free to hit the subscribe button. Maybe share it with your Shadow Priest friends. And I will see you guys in the next video. Peace!